Afternoon to the rest of the narcissistic abuse survivor community. This video is going to be in regards to what I call baby boomer supremacism and also boomer logic. It's topics that are rarely talked about, although there are some very good videos by Ollie Matthews on the topic of narcissistic abuse by baby boomers and how that generation was programmed for narcissism. Another person I'd like to give a shout out to is Lisa. Her channel is called Cinnamon Girl, all one word, and she has some really good videos on narcissistic abuse committed by baby boomers as well. And, please excuse the shiny lips. It's wintertime and I have big lips, so I have to wear chapstick all the time. It's kind of annoying, but, big lips do have their advantages too. Anyway, baby boomer supremacism, what is it? Well, it's a term that I came up with a few years ago. It's caught on a little bit, but it's basically when somebody born between 1946 and 1964 thinks they're better than anyone else, regardless of merit, education, etc., solely because, they are part of that baby boomer demographic, that somehow makes them a superior person just by virtue of being a part of that group and, their advanced age now. Age doesn't necessarily mean wisdom. This is something I've encountered throughout my whole life. It's something I didn't, couldn't put in the terms for the longest time. Uh, and it's, basically it's very narcissistic. Their thoughts in this, like they'll just assume that they're better or they know more on a topic that they might know nothing about. Uh, to be clear, let me put it out there that not all baby boomers are baby boomer supremacists, just like, not all white people are white supremacists, though I would say in terms of baby boomers, the majority of them are baby boomer supremacists, so at least 51%, at least in the area I grew up in. I can't speak for uh, everywhere, but in suburban Philadelphia, I would definitely say the majority of baby boomers are baby boomer supremacists, but not all of them are. So, this belief, they'll use boomer logic, which a lot of times is just platitudes or declarations that they know. In my experience, their favorite term is I just know. Like they'll say something to you that makes no sense. Like, for example, a few years ago, when I was testing to become a professional firefighter outside of this area, I was explaining to my family, I think it was around Christmas time. Yeah, some Christmas party, about the testing process and how it takes months because there's, psychological, physical, written, medical. It's a very long process that you have to go through to get into a professional fire department. Same with police too. It's pretty much the same process. But anyway, where I grew up, despite the fact that it's a fairly densely populated suburb of Philadelphia, they don't have paid firefighters because Pennsylvania is stuck in the past. And we don't have county and county level police and fire. Everything's done on the township level, and it's a holdover from pre-industrialization. Like the system was created in 1902, and the other states that did it this way all broke away from it after World War II because it didn't make sense. And these little townships and stuff are riddled with nepotism and cronyism. But aside from that, so I need to get that out, just to give a little background. So my mom's sister, I'm explaining that, yeah, once I get in, because I'd gotten my offer at the time and I was just waiting for the academy to begin in 2 months. I'm like, yeah, finally going to go down there. I got 7, 8 months of paid training at $27 an hour. And that just blew her mind. Like she just like jumped up and got just, oh, no, like, they can't be paying you that much. That's not how it works. Like you have to volunteer and put yourself through academies. That's how it is everywhere. And then I explained, I'm like, no, that's only how it is here. Like even the police have to do that in the area I grew up. I'm like, no, that's not how it works, anywhere outside of, suburban and rural Pennsylvania. I mean, the cities don't work that way, but and she just jumped up and declared, no, no. I'm like, well, how do you know? You've lived in, the county I grew up in, my aunt. I'm like, you've lived in this county your whole life. Like, how would you know how anything works outside of this area? I just know. Just that indignant, like telling me, someone who got hired in this other state, who went through the whole process. So obviously I would know the system because, I'm a part of it. And, just by virtue of her being a baby boomer, her saying, I just know, she expected other people to back up her claim. And lo and behold, the majority of the other baby boomers did. just by the declaration of "I just know," and they tend to enable each other and stuff like that. Like if a boomer declares something to be true, it's almost like a tribalistic group think that the other boomers will defend them regardless of any logic or merit. It's also what I found with baby boomer supremacism is a smugness in an out of touch reality of like what the economy is today, housing prices, that kind of stuff from what it was, when they were young adults, like back in the 70s and 80s. Like I'm sure I'm not the only one, especially for anybody listening who grew up in the Rust Belt. How many times did a boomer say to you, like, oh, you're just too lazy. You won't go work, a factory job. You'll make decent money, but you got to work hard. When the reality is, it's like, I was getting lectured like this like back in the 2010s, and it's like the factory you're talking about closed in 1996 when I was in elementary school. It's like, oh, that's just an excuse. And then they like, well, the steel mill had a big hiring event in 1997, and all those guys got a contract that allowed them to keep their job. How come you didn't get in on that? I'm like, because I was 10. But that's an excuse. The fact that I wasn't, that I was still a child and couldn't get in while those places were hiring. Now they've all since, either shipped out or went to skeleton crews, and all the members of those crews are over 50 years old. But narcissistic baby boomers in particular, it's like a cult setting, like other people who've talked about narcissistic abuse will say they'll have like a leader more or less. Like in my narcissistic family, it's my mother's older sister, and they all like bow to her like a queen. She makes up the rules and everybody else just must follow them. Like she's been on this vendetta against me my whole life, saying that I need psychological help, basically because I'm not some like good old boy and I've wanted to leave this area since childhood. Gee, could it have been the abuse. But she finds out as like, that there's must be something wrong with him because, in her mind, it's like I live here. So therefore everybody would want to live here. Because if I'm here, that by definition makes it the best area in the world, even though there's no jobs here. But she would just declare me bipolar. That was her big one, bipolar. I even got accused of dissociative identity disorder once, and there's multiple personalities. That's, very rare. But she would make these declarations, and my mother would even listen to her and drag me to a psychologist and be tested, and nothing would come up. I mean, yeah, I was on Ritalin for a couple years in the mid 90s, but if anyone who's around the same age as me, if a teacher said you needed medicated back then, they would just medicate you. Ritalin was probably the most overprescribed medication for children in the 1990s. That was like the diagnosis du jour back then. But again, it only lasted 2 years. But more recently, she says the same things. And I went through, very in-depth psychological testing for my job as a professional firefighter. That included polygraph examinations too, given to me by retired FBI profiles. And I tested for multiple departments. So I went through this from more than just one doctor. And if something was, off with me psychologically, surely one of these highly trained professionals would have found something. They didn't, but, she insists on putting me down and making me seem like I deserve nothing. Like, my family, they want me to be like a landscaper for $12 an hour working with ex-cons who didn't finish high school. I mean, it's like, why? Like, what's, it's what this area has to offer. It's like, well, I want to leave anyway. So, but getting back to double standards, her son, he's a big shot volunteer firefighter. He's 18 years older than me. He hasn't worked a full-time job since 2004. He mooches off of his very nice, very hardworking nurse wife and has multiple affairs. But, my aunt, the queen, has stated that that's okay. So there's these rules that, no one can ever talk about his affairs. Like that's just off the table. It's okay for him. It's okay for him because she says so. And, anybody can't dare to talk about it. Well, I did this past Christmas because once again, he was going off about, all my supposed psychological problems. And his evidence was citing some eccentric behaviors I had as a child in the 90s. I'm in my 30s now, and he just knows because I used to wash my hands a lot when I was a kid. I was a little OCD. I didn't like my toys or my controllers for my video game systems to be like sticky or dirty. So before I would play, I'd wash my hands. And my mother's OCD, so that was kind of drilled into me as a child. But back to the point with boomer logic, the best thing you can do to confront it is have undeniable proof, because then you will expose them for what they are. They'll try to like keep telling you you're wrong, but when you have like, irrefutable evidence, then they just become more erratic and even less rational, and they really make a spectacle out of themselves. So if you can, have proof of some kind, then that's your best bet to stop being berated, because the majority of people, even other boomers, will be forced to relent at that point, and the boomer narcissist who's on the attack will just look like a fool. Like, I'll give you an example. Back during the Democratic primaries this last time around, I said what a mistake it would be to nominate Biden, because Biden's a neoliberal corporatist, and neoliberal corporatism is what led to the rise of Trump, because the Democrats abandoned the working class and did NAFTA, and especially the working class in the Rust Belt wanted anything but the status quo, either a Reaganite on the Republican side or a Clintonite on the Democratic side. And Trump came in and said, how bad NAFTA was and that he was going to stop TPP. And they're like, hey, this guy may be kind of racist and mean, but he sounds like he's actually going to do something for me and not just care about Wall Street and his donors. So they took a shot. Now, Trump by and large ended up being just a charlatan. I don't want to get too deep into politics, but I'm into it. But anyway, Trump basically just was a standard neocon on most levels. Credit where credit's due, though. He did stop TPP, so that was cool. I got to give him credit for that. But back to my point with the primaries. So Biden, gave a big speech during the primaries where he said, where people like my age and a little bit younger, like basically from like 25 to like 35 was the majority of this crowd. And they were talking about how we don't get the same opportunity as like people Biden's age got, and specifically talking about the price of college. And Biden told them that, to give him a break and that he has no empathy for us. Now, what the fuck is that? Like, this is a guy who expects us to vote for us after he basically said, I only care about my generation and I only care about my donors, because he kept defending Wall Street and stuff. Well, I brought this up in a debate saying how a progressive would be a better candidate and, would get the youth vote out and probably beat Trump easier. And I brought up that point about his no empathy speech. And, the establishment Democratic boomer types in my family swore up and down that didn't exist. Oh, he never said that. I'm like, it's on tape. Like, it's not something I'm taking out of context from an interview. I pulled it up on my phone. It's like, here's him saying it in his own words. I'm like, well, that's still not true. It's like, not true. Like, you just saw and heard him say it, but that's their logic there. If they say it's not true, then they think of it as not true. Reality doesn't matter. The fantasy in their head is all they care about. If they're convinced something's one way, it is nearly impossible for them to shatter that, that delusional world. But your best bet still is, if you have proof, to call them out, because then you just make them look the fool. If you have proof that they can't deny, then to the majority of people, even, those that are a little on the narcissistic side, they're going to have to relent and be like, oh, this person may not know what they're talking about after all. Boomer supremacism, in other words, is they act as if everything is the same from when they were growing up. So they consider like Gen X, millennials, Gen Z, we're all failures for not being where they were at this stage of life. And Gen Z, you guys get a little break because you're still pretty young, but they don't understand that, like, you can't just get a high school diploma and walk into, any of these factories that don't exist anymore and get a $25 an hour job and be able to afford, a house, which is, they paid a third for, and, have a family and all that. Like, the idea just baffles them. It's like, well, I paid for my college working as a waitress in the summer. It's like, yeah. And, I worked 60, 70 hours a week, on a golf course over my summers in college. And guess what? I still had to take out loans. Why? Because it costs more. And I'm a perfect example of this. I went to the same state university as my father did. Both of us as in-state students. We even had similar majors, but he graduated in 1978. I graduated in 2010. And we compared cost, and, adjusting what he paid, adjusted for inflation, to put it in $2010, it was a third. like literally a third. I mean, what does that say about our society and, boomer leadership? I mean, that's a point of baby boomer supremacism right there. Their leadership, everything they've done since they've seized power in the 1980s, where they've been the dominant force in government, everything they've done has been on the basis is what's best for my generation and screw everybody else. I mean, it's no coincidence that the Social Security benefits are set to be reduced to 80% of what they are currently when people born in 1965 start collecting. And what do you know? Coincidentally enough, that just happens to be the first year of Generation X. I mean, that shows their failure as as leaders of the country, as politicians, when the richest generation ever, ever is leaving their children worse off than they were. I mean, look at what their parents did for them. Look at what the World War II generation had to overcome to leave the baby boomers. They paid a heavy price in blood for that society. And all the boomers had to do was maintain it. I mean, I think most of us younger generation people would be pretty happy if we got the same opportunity that the baby boomers had. And they'll sit there and rig the system and tell you that you had the same opportunity as them. Meanwhile, a lot of them, another point about baby boomer supremacism, they never have enough. Like I know, quite a few boomers that are in their 60s, they're retired, they got a cushy pension, they got Social Security, and they have assets over $1 million, but they call themselves poor and they need more. It's like you're 65 years old now, and that's not enough for I'll be generous and say 20 years you have less. They never have enough. It's always about them. They refuse to accept the fact that they're old. I mean, some of the younger viewers here may not be old enough to remember, but for people my age and older, those that are, you remember when like the World War II generation was like in their 60s and 70s. They weren't still trying to be in the spotlight saying this is our time and acting as if they're 45 and it's all about them. No, they sat back, they did their thing, they tried to mentor and knew that they were at a different stage of life and tried to enjoy their golden years the best they could. And a lot of them were the glue that kept a lot of communities together. I mean, boomers bitch today that the sense of community's gone and community cohesion and all that was there when they were growing up. It's like, yeah, because you narcissistic scumbags didn't maintain it. It's like your parents eventually either got too old to where they weren't able to do activities like that, or they passed away. I mean, it was a sense of community really did die when the World War II generation died. So if you come across boomer logic, don't let it upset you. If you think it sounds irrational and not true and that someone's just trying to break you down, then that is exactly what it is. The most important thing to remember about boomer logic and narcissistic abuse as a whole is you're not allowed to be right. They've targeted you for a reason because there's something about you that terrifies them that they want to destroy. Either they know deep down you're more intelligent than them, they definitely probably realize that you have more integrity than them and more honor, and they know that you're not just going to fall in line behind their bullshit and that you're liable to call them out on it and their double standards. So that's why they try to discredit you. And sadly a lot of times they are successful because, like I said, with boomers, there tends to be this group think and tribalistic thing where if one boomer says something, the other boomers will automatically back it up. Like they'll enable each other. As Ali Matthews said in one of his videos, in a lot of respects, boomers mentally never left 10th grade. And that's really what it is. I mean, if you take a look at like groups of boomers, they act like high school kids, and they sit and look down on everybody else for having to struggle because we didn't have the opportunity they had, and they're looking down on us like we're the cool kids, and you'll never be as good as us. I mean, yeah, when you destroy the greatest economy that ever existed and the world's strongest middle class in a generation, yeah, I don't think anybody will be as good as you for a while because you're still clinging on to power and fucking things up. But just know that it's not you. you know, and be aware that, baby boomer supremacism is a real thing. Like I said, Joe Biden is a great example of it. He clearly only cares about his generation and his donors. The main thing is to know what it is and know what you're dealing with. And with boomer logic, how can I put this? It doesn't make any sense, their logic, but you'll never convince them of that. The best you can do is if a boomer is using boomer logic on you, is to make the other non-boomers aware, like, of what's going on, and just call it out for what it is. Be like, this doesn't make any sense, or how can they just know? Like with my example, when I said, how can you know how the pay rate and hiring process is of a fire department in a different state when you've lived in like the same town in another state your whole life? You wouldn't. Logically, you have no way of knowing that, and you just say that, and anybody who's not half a narcissist will realize that the person attacking you, the boomer narc, is just trying to make you look bad because they just don't like you. You're just their target. Future videos I plan to do, I'm going to be alternating between narcissism and INFJ stuff. I'm going to do a follow up to the last INFJ video I did. It's basically going to be about like, what are the majority of INFJs looking for, in a partner? It's like, what does an INFJ look for in a girl? And I'm going to get a little bit into that. A little preview of it is basically, someone who's genuine and sweet and intelligent and isn't afraid to be themselves and doesn't give a shit about groupthink. Because INFJs, for the most part, we don't, we don't care if we're not in the cool crowd. We've usually been told we march to a beat of a different drum our whole lives, and we tend to have a lot of integrity, which again makes us targets for narcissism. So just remember, baby boomer supremacism sadly is a real thing. It's not talked about enough. It needs to be called out more and more. I think, the country as a whole would be doing better if people called out baby boomer supremacism and boomer logic for what it is, and just, hit them with facts. Inflation calculators are a great tool for that. When they try to say like, "Oh, you think you're poor? This is how much I made." When I first got out of college, and you find out that like that number in 1978 was equal to like 50 grand in today's money, and it's like, oh, wait, that's only like 15 grand a more a year than I made, and not to mention with housing and stuff too. Always go to their inflation calculator, because they'll try to, when they're trying to argue housing prices with you, inflation will be a thing, and they'll be like, oh, well, what I paid back then, it's what, it would be the same as you're paying now adjusted for inflation. No, it's usually less than half. And with, you know, suddenly with college, then inflation isn't a thing. So always call them out when they use double standards and try to change things on the fly if it's true or not. Just remember, the boomers never going to relent. They are always going to think they're superior, but it's our job to call them out on their bullshit and lies and not let them beat us down, and to stand up for other targets of boomer narcissistic abuse. So that's my little spiel about that, and I'll check in with you guys soon on another INFJ video. Well, anyone who listened, thanks.